Okay, so I have everything here ready to go. I'm going to be using black sewing thread to attach the fabric to my rods, to my bars. I have used several different kinds of material to attach fabric. I've used sewing thread, I've used embroidery floss, I've used a very thin pearl cotton, such as what is used for fine crochet. Pretty much anything will work. You're just looking to have something that's strong enough to hold a good basting stitch to the webbing of your rod. I used to use my sewing machine. I would set the setting on the longest stitch count on my sewing machine, and as long as you have enough clearance behind the machine, you can usually run the rod through. I've stopped doing that recently because we have recently increased the size of the majority of our rods to be a 3/4 inch diameter. And I just find it's a little tricky sometimes to maneuver it under the foot of the machine. And I would really hate to damage the foot of my machine by, you know, accidentally having my needle thread, the screw that holds the needle in place is on the side where it could, when the foot comes down, it could hit. And this is a little bit too high. The clearance is not quite enough, and I would not want to damage my machine. So I've gone back to just simply basting my fabric on. It's very simple, very straightforward, and I think you'll agree. I've got my pins ready. As you can see, I have plenty of brand new pin cushions, but this one belonged to my husband's grandmother, and it is a staple in my workshop. I use it all the time, and I love that bit of family connection. The project that I'm going to be attaching onto my rods today, I'll have the details down below, but just in case you're interested, you're a stitcher, you want to know, Jan Hicks Creates, Palace of the Winds. I am doing a blue custom floss conversion on this. I was working on a Q-snap, but I generally find that if I'm working in a Q-snap, I like the entire size of the design, the finished size, to be available in that Q-snap window. And my Q-snap was just slightly too small for this project. So I've decided to transfer it over to scroll rods. Thought it would be a great opportunity to show you what I'm going to do. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pin it in place. When I'm pinning my fabric, the size of my rods, these are 16 inches long. The standard size that comes with the lap frame is 20 inches. Standard size that comes with the Mark II is 30 inches. We do offer them for sale in a variety of different lengths. I do tend to keep my projects on scroll rods, and then I simply roll them up for storage when I'm not working on that particular project. So when I begin the process, I want to look at the width of my fabric, the width of my rod, and where I would like to start attaching it. I usually go from right to left. I am right-handed, that is my dominant hand, so I always start pinning on the right side of the fabric. I also do allow for the fact that the fabric is going to give just a little bit as you're attaching it on. So I want to make sure that I'm giving myself plenty of room. The width of my fabric is almost, as you can see, the entire length of my rod. So I'm going to want to make sure that I start fairly close to the side of the rod there. All right, so let's put that first pin in place, and then I will quickly pin it down the rest of the way so that you can see. As you're pinning, this is your chance to aim for a fairly straight line. I will usually use the webbing. The webbing has great, you know, very visible lines on it. Let me bring it a little closer so you can see. So I tend to try and follow that line, you know, as closely as I can, because remember, you're going to be basting it down again anyway, so you've got some wiggle room in this. The the pinning of the fabric on is just giving you a starting point so that you're not trying to deal with loose, floppy fabric while you're trying to pin it down with your sewing thread. There we go. We now have everything pinned basically in place. Let's thread up a needle and baste it down. Needle, a sewing needle with a sharper point is going to give you an easier time when you're sewing through the webbing. Okay, so I have a nice substantial knot at the end of my sewing thread and a length of double thread that is more than the length of my rod, so I will not run out of thread before I get to the end. So I'm just going to come in at the beginning. I like to take a few stitches right at the very, very edge, because tacking down those corners can help keep the sides of your fabric nice and connected, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to take a couple of stitches here at the end, and since I now have that bottom corner down, I can take out that first pin, which will give me a little bit more room to work here. There we go. I'm not going for neatness with these basting stitches. I simply want it to, you know, get my fabric attached to the rods. Okay, so now we're going to start taking those basting stitches, and because I am using a doubled up sewing thread, I'm not going to be taking super tiny stitches. I do serge my fabric before I stitch with it, and I find that I do like to take my basting stitches into the serged portion of my fabric, because I just find that makes it nice. And as you can see, as I'm going along here, pushing it along, this is why I make sure to start nice and far over, because I already know by the time I get to the other side, I'm going to need that space. Now that I'm at the other corner, I am going to do exactly the same thing on this side that I did on the other. I will do 2 or 3 extra stitches. Just to make sure that it is really nicely tacked down. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the back of the webbing. I'm going to take 1 extra stitch through the webbing there. I'm going to come through my thread like that so that it takes a little knot, and that is it. Snip my thread, and side number 1 is attached. That's about it. So now I'm going to do the same thing for scroll rod number 2. So I can see, because this is going to be the top, see where it is, approximately where it's come to on the rod. I want to make sure that that's where I start. That closeness is where I start my attachment on the second side. Now, one thing I should mention, because somebody's going to ask, I sew my fabric on to the top of the webbing, because when I stitch, I like to stitch what's called in the well or in the ditch. So I like the back of my fabric to be flush with the twill. And that's for that's a two-pronged reason. First of all, it just means that as your work is being rolled up, and so let's say you've got a huge project and the work that you've already stitched is rolled up from the bottom, your live stitches are always on the inside of your roll. And so when you're touching this part with your hands, it's kept clean. So your work is always kept clean. The other reason is that when you're on the back of your fabric, let's say you're working close to the rod, it's much easier to end your threads when the back of your fabric is flush with the back. You can really get your fingers in there well to end your thread. So not everybody likes to do it this way, so this is just the way where I attach it. Okay, my second rod is pinned in place. Fabric is pinned in place. Let's baste it down. And that is that. There you have it. Both scroll rods are sewn on. Look, they look nice and even. And one other thing that I thought of while I was basting this down, I mentioned before that I like to stitch in the serged section. Of course, that's not necessary. Serging my fabric is simply personal preference. Absolutely not a necessity. You can baste any fabric down. But again, if you do not have a serged edge, you may want to do your basting slightly higher up on your fabric to avoid, you know, that fraying that generally tends to happen when it's not serged, so that it remains nice and secure on your rod. And that's it. I hope this was helpful. Happy stitching.